Hi, this is Brent, and in today's video we're going to go through the section under data modeling and the custom types and Swift testing. We're going to take a look at the tutorial model data with custom types. So let's go ahead and get started. In Xcode, let's create a new project. We've selected iOS, we have an app, choose next, and we're going to call this score keeper. And we'll leave everything as it is for now. We won't worry about the testing system yet, but we'll talk about that in the next video. Go ahead and choose next, pick a location, and we'll create the project. For this application, what we're doing is creating a way to keep score. And the first thing we'll do is go through a few ways of modeling the data using some arrays. And then after that, we're going to show a better way of keeping track using custom data models. So for now, let's go ahead and start with an array of player names. And so we'll create a state variable. So remember, state variables are private var, and we'll call this players. And this is going to be an array of strings. And so let's go ahead and give ourselves a handful of names. For now, we'll just go with ones we've seen before. So we have Elisha, Andre, and Jasmine. Next, in our VStack, let's remove these two items, and we want to use a for each view, which goes through an array and will generate the view for each item. And so for our case, we're going to start with for each, and we're going to say from 0 ... to less than players count, and then we press comma. And then remember, we need a unique ID, and so in our case we're just going to refer to the description for each item. And then in the opening brace we'll say index in. And then from here, we are creating a text field, and we'll call it name. And then the text is, we're going to bind it to the players array at index. Okay, so let's talk about this. Right now we're saying the range that we're going through is from 0 to less than the players count. Now the reason we say less than is that the index of an array is what they call a zero index, meaning the first item is 0, the second item is 1, the next item is 2, and so on. So when we reference 0 to the players count in this case is 3. There's 3 items in this array. If you were to say 0 to 3, you would end up with 4 values. So we don't want to do that. We want to end up with 0 to 2, because this is 0, this is 1, and this is 2. So that's why we use the less than symbol when we do this range. And then finally, we're using a text field so that we can edit the text and make updates as we go. Next, after the for each view, let's add a button. And we're going to say add player, and then comma system image, and then we'll use plus. And then in our action block, we're going to say players.append, and in this case, we'll add an empty string. So if we go ahead and test that, if we click player, then it gives me an extra, it adds a text view, and I can go ahead and change the text for each player as we go. The next thing we want to do is create a score for each player. And temporarily, we're just going to use another array to keep track of our scores. So we're going to say at state private var, and we'll call it scores. And this will be an array of ints or integers, and then we set it equal to an empty array. In our view, in the for each block, we're going to add a stepper, which is a type of view that has a plus and minus to it. So we'll say stepper, and then the text is going to be the index. So we're going to say scores index, and that'll be the value. Then we have a comma. The value will then be, we bind it to scores index. Now we're going to get an error, and notice that it crashed, and that's okay. We're going to fix it here in a second. But what's happening is right now we have an empty array of scores, but for each of the players, we're trying to add the value. We're trying to use the value from the scores array. Well, this is a problem because we don't have any values in there yet. The tutorial is showing us this way because this is technically one way to create this type of data object where you have an array for values for players, an array for scores, but you have to keep them in sync. Otherwise, you run into this error because they don't line up. In a minute, we're going to go through and do it the proper way, but the tutorial wanted to show you, hey, this is one way to do it, and this is why using just basic value types won't always work. To fix this, we need to give ourselves some default values, and so I'm just going to go ahead and add 3 zeros. And so now we have, over here in our view, we've got the player, we've got their score, and then we have a stepper that updates the value of the score. If we go ahead and add a player, notice that the preview crashes. And I bet you know why. The reason why it's crashing is because all of a sudden we've added a new player, but the scores don't match. We've added we've added a fourth player, but we haven't updated the score because we have now 4 in the players array and only 3 in the scores array. And when we go through and index the scores, it's asking for an index that doesn't exist, and that's why it crashes. We can fix this by, in the button closure, we can say scores.append and pass in a 0. So now if we refresh the preview and we add a new player, now we get a player and the score, and it doesn't crash. This again is one reason why it's tricky to try to use the default types that are available to us, which are strings and ints and arrays, in order to keep track of it, because it's very troubling to try to keep track of the exact number of players and the exact number of scores so that they always match, so that if you're looping through one array, it's going to expect it in both arrays. And so this again is not the best way to do this. Let's add one more view element. Let's put a spacer at the bottom, and so now everything is pushed to the top. Now we want to move forward and create our own data type. And so let's come up here and we're going to add a new file. So right click on the scorekeeper folder and click new file from template. This time we're selecting iOS and we're selecting Swift file. In the past we've done a Swift UI file, but in our case we want a Swift file. Go ahead and choose next. And we're going to call this player. Now, notice when you have the template for a Swift file, you don't have all of the UI code that you would have in a Swift UI file. Swift UI file will have a struct for the view and then also a preview. But for a regular Swift file, you've just got the basics. Let's start off by going down here and creating a new type, and we're going to use a struct. So the keyword is struct, and then we'll call it player. And then we do the opening curly brace. And so now we have the foundation for a new type called player. Let's add two properties, and we're going to use the var keyword. So we're going to say var, and then we're going to say name, which is a type of string, and then var score, which is of type int or integer. Notice we're using the var keyword because these values will change over time. Next thing we need to do is we need to make the player type using the identifiable protocol. And to do that, we add a colon and then a space, and we say identifiable. And that's the keyword that says this player struct conforms to the identifiable protocol. Now we have an error because it's not conforming to that. The reason for that is that the identifiable protocol requires that we have a specific property called ID. And in our case, we need to add that. And we're going to use, we'll use a let keyword because this value won't change. And we call it let ID equals, and we're going to use a helper function called UUID and open and closing parentheses. And so what this does is it returns what's called a universally unique identifier. So UUID. It's a long ID value that is guaranteed to be unique. So now notice that the error went away. Let's go back to our content view, and we need to refactor this code so that instead of using these player arrays and scores array, we're going to use instead an array of player objects. So the first thing we'll do is we will delete these two state variables and create a new one, state private var, and we're going to call it players, which is an array of player objects. And we're going to set it equal to, and then we're going to create our array of players. And so the way we do that is, notice I'm using the straight brackets, and we're going to create a new player. And remember, the player has a name and a score, so if you press tab, it auto-completes. And so in our case, we're going to go with the names that we had before. So Elisha, and then we're going to start with an empty, with 0 for the score, and then we press comma, and then we have another player object, and again I press tab, and now I can fill in, and so I have Andre, and then I tab to get to the next value to fill in, and we'll set that to 0. Then we add a comma after that, and again we're going to have another player, and we're going to call this Jasmine. Okay. So now we've created our array, but notice that we've got some errors, so let's go ahead and fix that. First thing we'll do is we need to remove this, and all we have to do is pass in a binding. So you remember we use the $sign to bind to the players array, and so now it's going to iterate over the players array, and then here we're going to bind to each player in, and for this one we need to bind to the player. So player.name, and then for the stepper we want to reference the score, but we're going to say player.score, and then for the value we bind to the player.score. Because we don't have a players array and scores array, we just have player objects. What we would do then is we would say players.append, and then we would create a new player object, and we'd pass in an empty string and then 0. Now let's go ahead and run this and make sure that it's still working. You can add more players, update the scores, and it works just fine now. Let's review again what we've done. So we've created an array of player objects, and it's called players. And so then we've set some default values where we've created some 3 players. And then in our for each block, we pass in the players array. And because this conforms to the identifiable protocol, we don't have to pass in the specific ID. It picks it up because the player object conforms to identifiable. And so that means that each object is unique. And because we have that UUID in our player object, in the player struct, that means that every time you create a new player, it's going to have a unique ID, and then they can still have the same name or score, but because it's a unique ID, they are treated as separate, unique players. We updated the text field to bind to the player.name, and then in the stepper, because we're using string interpolation, we can't use the binding. If I put the $sign there, it's going to bind, it's going to throw an error because it doesn't like that. I don't understand it completely, but you would think that you would bind to it, but instead we need to reference the current player dot score, and then that works just fine. But when we pass the value, then we use the binding like that. So just keep that in mind. The nice thing is that Xcode will throw an error if something is passed in incorrectly, but I'll have to look into why this is. But anyway, just something to notice. Let's go ahead and clean up the UI a little bit, add a little more style. First, let's put a title on top, and what I want to do is come up here, and above the for each, I want to give myself a text, and we'll call it score keeper. And then let's use some modifiers. Let's use a font, and we'll say title. And then we want to say bold for enhancing it there. And then finally, we want to give ourselves some padding, dot bottom. And so now we have a little more padding between the title and the top of our list. Then the other thing we want to do is set the values so that everything lines up. We're going to use on the VStack, we're going to say alignment, and we're going to say dot leading. And then I can go ahead and delete. I'm using the delete key to delete that. So there we go. So now notice that everything is lined up on the left based on the alignment for the VStack. We're going to embed the for each view in what's called a grid. And a grid view is nice because it lays things out in columns, and you can have grid rows and various things to change the look of the column. So right click on the for each and then choose embed. And then we're going to call this a grid. And then from here, we need to add a grid row in order to identify the separate columns and the titles that go into that. We will wrap the text field and stepper inside grid row. So just type grid row, do the opening curly brace, and then come down here below the stepper and do the closing curly brace, and then that formats it. And notice now we've got these 2 columns going across. Within the grid, we can add another grid row and put some labels. So we'll say grid row, and then we're going to have a text that is player and a text that is score. So now notice how we have this grid row here that has 2 columns. So we have player and score. Let's add a font modifier to the grid row that shows our labels. And we're going to say font, and then we're going to use headline. And that makes it bold and a little more contrast. Then on the grid row for the text field that we have, um, let's add, what we're doing is, notice the stepper is this, its stepper starts right here where it shows the 0 and then these two items. Notice how they're not lined up. And the reason for that is that the stepper label fills the available space all the way across. And in order to replace that, we want to use a label for the score, and this will give us a little more control. So after our text field for name, we're going to say text, and we're going to call it, we're going to wrap it in the backslash open parentheses. We're going to say player.score. And notice it shows up twice, and so we can actually use a modifier on the stepper to say labels hidden. And now notice the score is over to the right and it lines up in the column a lot better. We can add a modifier to this player label, and we could say grid column alignment and say dot leading. And now that label shows up to the left and lines up with the player names. Finally, we can add some padding to the grid view, and we'll go to the bottom of the grid and we'll say dot padding, and we'll say vertical, and it spaces things out a little bit better. All right, so that's how to use a custom data model in order to create an array of players. And the player object has a name and a score, and we can use that information in our UI to present, and we're using a grid and a grid row to line things up into columns. Okay, let's go to the back to the tutorial and let's check our understanding. Okay. If you have an array with 3 items, what happens if you try to access the 4th index in the array? Well, we saw it. It crashes. When should you declare your own types? Never, always, sometimes. So I would say sometimes. When using them makes modeling data easier and less error prone. Sweet. This is the art of data modeling. Think critically about what you want to build and whether off-the-shelf foundation types are sufficient, or if you should make things simpler by building your own types. True or false? To make a type identifiable, make it conform to the identifiable protocol and ensure that it has a UUID property. Okay, this is a trick question. Because identifiable is not a UUID property. It is an ID. It has to have an ID property. UUID happens to be something that generates a unique ID, but you could use other values if you wanted. You just need to make sure that it's guaranteed to be unique every time a new object is created. All right. Great job. Well, thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.